a great pleasure. Welcome to Miguel Paul Poast. Paul's coming from Rutgers University. He's a Michigan Ph.D. And so Vincent and I think have been trying to, when you kind of look at the list of invited speakers for this year, to get these jacks of all trade. And Paul might be the epitome of that, right? So here's someone who does both IPE and security, and then is a bona fide methodologist. He's published in political analysis. I think he may actually attend PolMeth, which is something else. And so this paper then kind of takes all this into account, and well, we look forward to hearing about the politics of sovereign default. Welcome.
Thank you, Christoph. Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. I had a very nice dinner last night, wonderful coffee this morning, so it's just had a great trip, and apparently lucked out with the weather too. Actually, I was able to have a pleasant walk this morning. I was a little worried about that, but it was pleasant. So had a very nice time so far. So yeah, the paper I'm presenting today, as a way of background, so Patrick was one of my students at Rutgers and recently started as an assistant professor at University of Houston. And part of the way that him and I became engaged together in terms of working was when I arrived at Rutgers, one of the first things my senior colleague, Jack Levy, told me was, you need to talk to Patrick. And I was like, okay. And the reason why was because I had been doing some work on the economics of warfare, in particular war financing. And it turns out that was what Patrick was interested in writing his dissertation on. And so began helping Patrick with that. He wrote an outstanding dissertation, an article from it published in JCR. He went and did some work in the Rothschild archives to kind of look at the debt financing they had done. And so in the process of doing that, Patrick and I talked about, well, you and I should be working on some things together, once you get this whole dissertation thing out of the way, right? And when we started to look at wanting to do some more work on the financing of warfare, and when you're talking about the financing of warfare, a lot of that leads to looking at debt. That's a major way in which countries finance war. Well, what we sort of realized was that there were some more fundamental questions about debt, sovereign debt, than just those that pertain to war financing. And one of those major questions, and some other people that encouraged us to pursue looking at that, was just basically the pure politics of sovereign default. What determines when sovereigns actually default on their debt? And so the short of the story is that our work in looking at war finance has kind of led us to want to explore this broader question. But in many ways, we think by exploring this broader question, it will enable us to have better answers for when we go back to looking at war finance. So that in terms of some introduction, what I'm going to do today, I'd like to provide a little bit of a summary of where we're going with things today. So the question is, why do sovereigns default on debt? Okay. And key thing to remember, recently I used this phrase when I was giving another talk, and I think I like it. I'm going to try to put it into the next paper, which is, you can never remove the sovereign from sovereign debt, right? You can't remove it. I mean, ultimately, there's no surefire way to prevent a sovereign from deciding they're just not going to pay back their debt. There's never a sure way. Otherwise, it ceases to be sovereign debt. But be that as it may, why do sovereigns decide to default on their debt? And our argument is that it's always and everywhere a political decision. Okay? It is that governments, as you'll see, will always have a means to repay. They just may not like what that politically entails, that means. And one of the things we're going to say is that a major way to be able to get at this is to look at irregular leadership changes. Or to be quite simple, to look at coups. Okay? And that coups can lead to default. That's going to be a big part of what we're going to be arguing with this. And the reason why this matters through several reasons. First of all, it's that sovereign default just in general is a key topic that scholars like to look at when exploring the issue of credible commitments. Mike Tom's doing that, and others. But also Tom's himself, and this work very much builds on it, is in his excellent book, 2007 book, looking at 3 centuries of sovereign default and so forth, he says, well, what determines why some leaders default and others don't is heterogeneity in their preferences. But I'm not going to really explore what that is. Well, we want to explore what that is. And so we think that looking at irregular leadership change in coups can actually enable you to capture at least a component of that, having that heterogeneity in preferences that leads to default. And then we think that also it helps to put politics and make politics central to stories about default. And so that's why we think that this paper really matters. So again, this is where I'm going to be taking you today, and here's how I'm going to go about doing it. I'll continue to provide a little bit more motivation, then I'll actually go a little bit into our argument, lay out a few empirical implications of that argument, then go into the actual empirical analysis, kind of talk about the research design, data, and so forth, and then finally conclude. So that is the roadmap for today. So in terms of sovereign, consider a few examples here. So here's an article from the New York Times back in 1899. It says, Spain's vanishing empire, transfer of islands to Germany, announced by the Queen Regent. Now why did they do this? They were transferring these islands as a way to pay off their debt. This is how Spain was paying off some of their debt to Germany. Okay. So they said, hey, we have some territory. One of the ways we can do this is we'll just give them these islands, and that could help settle some of the debt. Another way to think about this, how countries can pay debt. The Indonesians, so let us quote, the Indonesians, the Koreans, and the Thais weren't sitting on tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. Okay. This was a statement also from the New York Times by an unnamed senior Clinton administration official on why the U.S. was bailing out Russia in 1998, but yet did not bail out those governments in 1997. Okay. And the argument is that, well, they weren't sitting on tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. The concern at the time was a way that Russia would try to pay off their debt would be to either sell those weapons or sell the technology for those weapons. Again, showing that that's a way that governments could pay off the debt. Say, oh, well, we've got these assets here, we'll just sell those. Finally, consider this picture here. Does anybody know what is this picture? Anybody know, have an idea of what this picture is? Okay. This picture, obviously it's some sort of beachfront or oceanfront view property. This is land in Greece that the Greek government decided to lease out as a way to acquire money to help finance its debt, okay, which has been, of course, a huge issue recently. The point to all three of these examples is that governments always have a means to repay. As long as the government has some territory, even the poorest, I even have in the example in the beginning of the paper, Tajikistan, one of the poorest countries in the world. But as a way to settle some of their debt with China, they had some land that the Chinese government said, oh, you know what, if you give us some of that land, sure, we'll settle this. Governments always have some means to repay. Could be the extreme examples like this. It could also be we're going to raise taxes. They just may not always have the political will to do so, right? They may not find that to be politically palatable. Sometimes selling off land may not be a politically attractive option. Raising taxes may not be a politically attractive option. Cutting social welfare spending may not be a politically attractive option. Economically and financially speaking, that's what you need to do. But governments may not want to do it. To kind of get at this was something that Thomas himself brought up. He says, why do governments pay or not? And this is a quote from his book. He says, some governments tighten their belts, they impose austerity at home to meet commitments abroad, but other governments snub creditors in good times as well as bad. The exact sources of this heterogeneity of preferences are interesting in their own right, but are not the focus of this analysis. So in his great book where he's looking at this, he says, look, some governments will take the steps necessary, even if it means selling land or what have you, to pay off debt. Other governments aren't going to take those steps. I'm not going to talk about what those are. That's what Tom says. Well, we think that that's actually pretty important. Can we somehow identify when governments are going to have this difference in preferences? And so that's really that's kind of our core objective of what we're trying to do is, can we somehow capture this heterogeneity in preferences for leaders of why it is that a leader will go or a government will decide all of a sudden, you know what, we will pay this debt versus, nah, forget it. We're not going to pay this debt. So our claim is that irregular leadership change can be a way of capturing when you will see this heterogeneity in preferences, when you will see a government suddenly decide, I don't want to pay debt. Okay? And the mechanism is this: irregular leadership change, or as we'll talk about in a little bit, mostly coups, okay, leads to a sudden change in preferences by leadership, because that's part of the point. When you're a coup, you're overthrowing the old leadership, you come in, that should lead to a change in preferences, and then that one of those changes should be default. Now, that wouldn't be the only change. This theory could have implications for changes in alliance treaties, changes in trade policies, changes in lots of things. But one of the key ones we would say would be it should lead to changes in your debt policy. Specifically, if you had previous obligations, you might decide, you know what, that was the old regime. I don't want to have I don't care about the reputation of the old regime. I want to establish a new reputation. One of those might be to simply say, whatever obligations the previous regime had, we're not going to be on the hook for it. And so, irregular leadership change, as defined by Gomez et al. In their massive data set where they went through, we'll end up using this data set, but as they define it, is it's removal and contravention of the established rules of the regime. Okay, you have a regime, you have certain rules. If somehow you come into power in contravention to those, then that is what we define as irregular leadership change. By and large, that means coups. Okay, by and large, that means coups. We'll talk about what this could also be. Foreign imposed regime change is another form of this, and I can talk a little bit about how we deal with that one as well. But basically, it means when a new leader comes in contravention of the established rules of the regime. Yes, sir.
How do you define default here? Is it any credit event or restructuring or rescheduling of public debt, or is it a repudiation of debt?
So the definition that we use is, in this case, we are relying on the definition by Reinhart and Rogoff in their big study of, this time it's different, which is their whole story about why defaults tend to happen and the creditors get suckered into it. And in those particular instances, I believe, I have to look at the paper exactly, I know absolutely it counts repudiations, complete repudiations. In terms of, does it count restructurings? I do not believe it's including restructuring. So I think it's only, this particular measure is only when the government has said, we're not paying.
Okay. So my question is motivated because if you look at the last, say, 20 or 30 years
Yes.
of sovereign debt distress, let's say, very few of those cases either involve a complete repudiation or a coup. So it strikes me a priority that you're limiting your data set to a very small number of cases here, ex ante.
Absolutely. And you're going to actually see that in a little bit. You're going to see that this, and I'm going to put out that caveat a little bit. We're not saying we're explaining all defaults. But what we are going to be saying is by looking at irregular regime change, it can allow you to get a clear idea of the extent to which this change in preferences will actually lead to default. In other words, it's kind of picking up where Tom's left off. It's not the only way that you could capture when this happens, but it would be, we think, a clear way to be able to identify this.
So I come at this from an economist perspective as someone who did a number of debt restructurings. So I think what might be a broader question to ask is, what are the political determinants of a credit event?
Mm-hmm.
A lighter case, not the full repudiation of debt, but if we look back at the 40 or 50 IMF programs that have happened over the last, let's say, 30 years in emerging markets that have resulted in some kind of debt rescheduling or restructuring, what were the political determinants that actually led to a restructuring rather than such substantial adjustment that you actually avoided some kind of credit event?
Right. And what I can do also is, I don't show it in this presentation here, but when we get to the Q&A, I have the papers PDF on the desktop. I can break, because we have on it the list of actual cases that we're talking about here.
Okay, great.
And so that'll help to give some more insight into this. All right, so basically, and so the idea here is, why do we think that irregular leadership change or coups can lead to default? And the reason why is because a big part of Tom's story is that, well, it's about reputation, and that if you care about your reputation, then you're going to want to honor debt and so forth. And the argument would be, if you've come into power through contravention of the established rules, you're going to have very little incentive to want to maintain the reputations of anything that was established under those old rules. It's like, we want to establish our own reputation at this point. It's not to say that it would perfectly predict default. It doesn't perfectly predict default, but we think that these type of leaders would be the most likely to go into default, largely because at this point that reputation mechanism is not as important to them. So, classic example of this, of course, is the Russian Revolution, right? When the Bolsheviks come in, they say, look, all the debts that have been acquired by the financing, particularly by France, lent to them through their alliance relationship, they said, look, we don't need to uphold these. That was part of the czarist regime. We want to establish our own reputation. We want to show that we're separate from that previous regime. And one way to do that is to go into default and to actually default on that debt. And it's just kind of the classic example of this. So an empirical implication of this argument, and just one of the implications, we actually tease out several others in this project, is that a regular leadership change will be associated with an increased probability of the country being in default. Okay, that's one of the implications of this. This is going to be the main implication I'm going to focus on in this presentation. There's a few caveats, kind of get to your question. There's a few caveats that I think are important to keep in mind. First one is we're saying not all defaults are explained by coups. Okay, we're not saying that. We're not saying that all defaults are explained by coups. What we are saying, though, is that coups are a major risk factor for default, and that coups can be a key way to kind of get at when you will see a change in the preferences of a leader, because that's kind of an ambiguous concept, and we think this is a way to make that more concrete. So if you see a coup, that should be a clear indication there's a change in preferences, and if Tom's is right, then we should be more likely to see a coup in that case, or to see a default in that case. And with another caveat is that coups, we do think that it can shed light on when there's been default in regular change, right? So like the biggest default in history, of course, was Argentina in 2001. Now, technically speaking, by going by our coding rules that we're going to be applying, we're not explaining this one. That was not a coup. But talking to people like one of my colleagues, Bob Kaufman, who knows a little about Latin America, we've been talking about that. Yeah, he basically said, look, that was about as close to a leadership change under regular conditions as you could have without being defined as a coup. You know, they virtually ran the guy out of town. There were all these protests, there was much of turmoil and so forth. It still was in line with the existing rules. It was not a coup. But you do see where there was a high level of political instability. There was a desire to want to distance itself, the new leader to distance himself from the existing leadership, to kind of establish a new chair out of town. So it can offer some insights into even a case of regular leadership change. But again, this one would not actually be one of the cases that were explained because it wasn't, strictly speaking, a coup. Okay. So, yes?
Just a quick question on this. Is time a factor here? So are you saying it increases the probability of default for a period of X number of years?
Yeah, so we actually haven't, this is a good suggestion. I'm going to write this down to maybe look at like how this can increase it and then see if there's like a decay to that.
Yeah.
What we simply do in this analysis here is if coup last year, does that increase the probability this year? But we haven't looked at any type of decay function.
Because studies of revolution show that revolutionary regimes at first kind of take an hostile position towards the international system and then eventually kind of get socialized and try to become normal members of the...
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. We haven't done that type of analysis yet. That's a good idea. Yes?
So I'm a little concerned about the causal direction here. So isn't it possible for the hypothesis that a country which is facing severe debt problems and has a political party which is very entrenched in a particular reputation mode, well, then you can predict that there's going to be a coup coming up.
Which is the case in Argentina, right? The
Yeah.
coup was the result of the people with signs in the thing saying no pagar la deuda. So they wanted to that's what they were pushing for, and the coup was the embodiment of that. So it's not that it was a coup and then the new guy says, well, let's distance ourselves. It's that
it was part and parcel of the causal story for the leadership change. Absolutely, and one of the things I'll talk about, I don't show the results here, but I can talk about this during the Q&A, is that led us to want to somehow account for this endogeneity, if you will. And one of the ways that we tried to account for that was to conduct matching analysis, to be able to say, okay, are we comparing just strictly similar cases on all these variables, but for the fact that there is a coup. That's one of the analyses we've done on this case. So this is something we're very much aware of because exactly, like the Argentine case and even some of these coups themselves can be due to concerns about default or that government's trying to honor the debt. We want to replace them. So you're absolutely right about that. And that's something that we've tried to think very carefully about with this.
Yeah, there's a nice related literature on the extent to which the debt restructuring leads to the dismissal of the finance minister within 6 months of the credit event. So that speaks to the reverse causality here that might be interesting to explore.
Yeah. Do you have off the top of your head an author?
I can email it to you after.
That would be very helpful,
Yeah.
thank you. Yes, be very helpful. All right. Any other questions? Okay, good. So again, keep these caveats in mind. We're not trying to explain everything, but we think that this is a way, whereas kind of Thomas just waves his hand and says, well, it's change in preferences. This is a way we think we can identify, does the change in preferences, what would be a clear change in preferences actually lead to default? So what we're going to do for this particular analysis here is we're going to do a large end study of looking across various cases, some of which experienced default, some of them didn't. So our unit of analysis is going to be the country year from 1875 to 2004. Reason why this time period is that's simply the time period for where we actually have this leader change data. Okay. We have default data going back much earlier, but we don't have the leader change data going back earlier. And so that's what constrains this particular time period for the analysis. Now the dependent variable is going to be country in default in year T. Now that doesn't necessarily mean default onset. We do look at default onset itself. The results I'm showing today, it's just, is that country classified as being in default in year T? Okay, and that's based on the Reinhardt-Rogoff DAC data. Okay. And then the key explanatory variable is going to be, was there irregular leadership change in year T minus 1? That's defined by the Gomez et al. Now, even T minus 1 doesn't account for fully this endogeneity concern, right? Because it can be an anticipation of it, it can be because of an ongoing process. So totally aware of that. And so some of the things we try to do to try to account for it. At the end of the day, can you totally address endogeneity in all its forms? What you can do is try to address it in some principled ways. And I can talk about what some of those principled ways are as we go along. So before I actually talk about doing like regressions or anything of this nature, let's just actually show the data and show some relationships just based on this data itself. Okay. So right here, right away, you're going to see, kind of go back to the point, look, what this chart shows is, basically shows the number of countries in default, okay, and then classifies them by, was that country in default preceded by a regular change in leadership, irregular change, or no change? Well, first of all, you can see blue, regular change, that tends to be most of these cases, okay? Absolutely, tends to be most of these cases. Irregular is not most of the cases, okay? You can see in some instances it comprises a fairly big chunk here in about the 1980s and 90s, a nice chunk. And you can see some of them are associated with no change at all, okay? So what this shows is that, kind of what I was saying before, we're not claiming that we're explaining all defaults. But what we think is useful to look at is the next chart here, which is to say, okay, if you're a country that experienced a regular leadership change, the percentage of those that then ended up being in default the next year, that's reported here. This is for irregular change. And so what this tends to show, we think, is that if you experience an irregular change, those particular countries are much higher risk for being in default relative to countries who experience regular changes. In other words, most defaults, as you can see, were experienced by regular change, but lots of countries have regular changes, right? Few of the cases were explained by irregular change, but very few countries actually experience irregular change. And so we think this highlights why this irregular change can be a particularly useful risk factor for exploring why default occurs. Okay.
This is not default onset, this is just being in default.
Being in default, that is correct. This is just being in default. Now, one way to kind of get another thing I like to do before pulling out any type of regression analysis, I think, is just also to continue looking at the data, is just do some simple crosstabs. And so what I did with this is we have here, were you in irregular leadership change? Was that observation classified as irregular leadership change in year T minus 1, yes or no? And then percentage of observations that were in default in the subsequent year. What you can see is that here 27% of the observations were in default in the subsequent year compared to only 17%. Okay? This bottom one's looking at default onset. Okay, that's a little bit trickier. I don't know what this thing is. That's 4% and 2% here. And so you can see that percentage of observations, if you experience irregular versus not experiencing it, you can see that it doubles the probability that you would be in default, okay, or that you would experience a default onset the next year. Now again, we're dealing with relatively rare events here, But you can see where, again, this kind of highlights where the irregular leadership change seems to dramatically increase the risk of either being in default or experiencing a default onset. And so this again makes us feel like, hey, this might be a useful factor for looking at why countries end up in default and how politics can influence that. So kind of going through that just description of the data, looking at the data, simple crosstabs. One thing I like to think is that usually when a crosstab relationship shows something like this, it typically doesn't matter what kind of regression analysis tricks I'm going to level on it. Typically, you're not going to break up that kind of relationship. This seems to be a pretty strong, these differences are statistically significant at the 0.99 beyond level. And so usually when you do that, it doesn't matter what kind of analysis tricks you do, that relationship's there. But endogeneity can still be a concern. There's still a whole host of concerns. So let's go ahead and let's expand the analysis to actually go into some multivariate analysis, see if we can control for some things, see if we can better account for endogeneity, and so forth. So again, same unit of analysis, country, year, dependent variable the same, key independent variable the same. Now I have a whole host of control variables, and I have an eye chart here in a second. You'll see them all showing up, including influation. I didn't notice the typo until I sent the slide out. It's like, ooh, influation, that must be, I'm not sure what that is. But we're dealing with all sorts of different economic as well as political variables that could be associated, or that previous literature talked about could be, impact a country's propensity to one, or at least the measures that they would have to take to try to honor their debt. Be it inflation rate, interest rates, were they in default previously, a whole host of things. And so that's hence the ... Now the estimation approach. The pure basic regression analysis we're going to do is just logit model, because we have a binary dependent variable. Are you in default or are you not? Cluster standard errors and random effects. But we also do this analysis with fixed effects. However, fixed effects though, I know, man, economists love fixed effects, but when you have a binary dependent variable that either if a country is always in default or never in default, those observations get kicked out, right? And so if you think that your theory might, to have a valid inference on your theory, you don't want to kick out countries that have never had default. If you think that that's an important thing, which I would think it is, using fixed effects may not be the best thing to do. Nevertheless, we do a test with it. It gives consistent results, but we think to be able to account for unit level heterogeneity, it's better to have random effects. So this is just one of the base tests that we do. Yes, Chris?
Your control for interest rates, is it the country interest rate?
Yes. Yes.
Or so it's the
yes, and if I'm correct, I'd have to ask Patrick on this one. So anything I don't know, I'll kick over. I'm going to say Patrick knows the answer. No, I believe that also was recorded by the Reinhardt-Rogoff data with that. And by the way, yes, I am aware of the concerns about the Reinhardt-Rogoff data that's found by the very able graduate students. So we are aware of these caveats. And one of the additional tests is we can try some other measures like default and so forth. But yes, that data came from, so it's the country interest rate. Are you wondering if there might be something about like global interest rates or like U.S. interest rates?
No, so I thought that it probably is the global interest rate because it must be so hard to collect the country interest rate. And but that's the relevant one.
Yeah,
so,
no, that would be the country. Yes?
Do you have data on attempts at regime changes as opposed to leadership change?
Attempts at regime change, yes. Let me make sure we're clear on it. I have data on regime changes, and we do account for that. But this is, what you said is interesting. Are you asking about not just regime, but actual attempts at trying to change regime?
So I mean, that's one way to get rid of the potential endogeneity problem, right? So the answer then would be a successful regime change happens in a period of financial distress. Probability is higher. So if you actually have the data for attempts at regime changes as opposed to successful ones, that might help you a lot, I think.
Would you want to definitely get it for failed coups? There's been people who've collected data on failed coups.
So that'd be a pretty immediate check, right? But that's it.
Yeah, so basically do like a placebo test kind of thing, like make that the variable of interest then?
Well, what you're checking now the dependent variable is the probability of a successful coup.
Okay.
And the independent variable is financial distress.
Makes sense. Yep, that makes sense. yes, because they do have attempted regime change, and that's an important distinction to make here, is that coups can lead to regime change. Not all regime changes are due to coups, there are different things, because you could come to power but still maintain the authoritarian dictatorship, right? You can still have a military regime, you just come to power through a coup. So regime change and coups are not the same things. And so as a result, there has been data collected on coup attempts, not necessarily all attempted regime changes, but still, that's a very good suggestion. Yes?
Can you just tell me how the dependent variable is coded? Is it 0, 1 as well?
Yes.
Okay. I'm wondering whether you could get some traction by multinomial there. Especially if you incorporate the comment of you just received this.
Like the partial restructuring type.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
because what would be interesting is that, and I don't know if you use margins or not, but with margins you could actually see the difference in probabilities depending on where you are. Well, either from 0 to 1 and from 1 to 2,
Right.
depending on how you code. And I don't know. I'm just looking at this, and I think that
I mean,
enormous
the
traction.
one thing though is if you do start to look at the partial ones, then now you do have to start making some distinctions, right? Of is it a large partial restructuring, is it a small one, is it 4 categories, is it 5? I mean,
Yeah, actually, my comment is germane to that, is actually expanding what 1 is here.
Yeah.
To say anything from a life rescheduling, where you're just reprofiling maturities outward, to a total repudiation,
Yeah.
is for creditors a default situation.
Yeah.
And certainly for CDS, that represents a default.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
anything that has a material impact on the net present value of the debt for creditors is generally considered by markets to be a default. So, you would get a much bigger data set by expanding what 1 looks like here.
No, and this is something I think is very good. That being said, given that we're only looking at full repudiations, in many ways it makes a more conservative test of what we're doing, because we're only looking at the times when it's full on default. However, the caveat that, as you said, that's become more and more rare.
Yeah, it doesn't happen anymore. Unless you're Correa in Ecuador, or another really extreme political leader, it just doesn't really occur.
And I should add, and I'll put the caveat that everything that Reinhard Rogoff code with it, I can't speak fully for. Patrick can a little bit more than I can. But I do know that there's some controversy even about, well, they code that as full default, but that was only partial default, or they include some partial defaults, but they say it's really full defaults. And so I know sometimes, even if depending on the data you're using, reasonable people can differ on whether should that be counted as a full default, should that be counted as a partial default, should Argentina be counted as a full default, because eventually people, they did take. So that's one thing to keep in mind with it, is that, and that's why I think what's ultimately important is that we try different ways of trying to measure the dependent variable. And we've done a few, but I think there's more ways we could capture the dependent variable.
I mean, I think basically since the 70s, let's say, the really interesting issue is, will countries or governments adjust enough to avoid any kind of treatment of their debt?
Yeah.
Or will they go to the IMF, get assistance, and then approach the market for some kind of restructuring?
Right.
Those are the two binary cases, rather than, do they just walk away from their debt and say, forget it?
But looking at the volume, right, you have lots of years with over 20 of these default events. So that can't all be full out default. It has to include some sort of restructuring.
Some,
because I can't imagine that in 1975 there would be 25 full out defaults, right? That just seems high.
Yeah, and again, this goes back to the ambiguity of how exactly it's coded in terms of when they count a country as in default, not default.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember exactly, but I'd be surprised if, consistent with his comment, that the number of observations you've got is actually full default. I think it's any restructuring or rescheduling.
I can't remember. All I can say is that I know we're using the Reinhard Rogoff coding, and there's, and reasonable people can differ on exactly what they're coding as, full, partial, so forth. But what is important is that it is capturing some essence of default here. It is capturing the idea that investors, somehow the government has said, we're not honoring fully our obligations.
A very quick question. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was still on the page. I think you're going to get to this, but in terms of controls, do you look at do you control for global capital mobility? Because one of the things that you suggest towards the end of the paper, I think, is that the reason why there is an increase in defaults is that increased global capital mobility essentially lowers the cost of defaulting, right? That, like, I mean, in Argentina is again a good case of this, that, you know, despite this dramatic default, they had, you know, creditors came back, like, you know,
Yeah.
quickly.
So we don't account for global financial capital mobility, say in the way of using like the Quinn measure of capital mobility and including that as a variable. What we do, however, is account for eras and account for, you know, kind of including time controls, count different years, because global financial capital mobility, especially starting in the 70s and then moving into the 80s, started to expand much more, which also changed the nature of the default game that countries were playing. So in that respect, we're capturing it, but that's still a blunt instrument. We probably could go, like, again, I know Quinn has data on the capital financial market openness of countries, so that could be one other way that we could capture that. So this is our eye chart, okay, just to show you there's lots of variables going on here. Urbanization, interest rates, we have regional ones. Anyways, this is hard to read. I'm not expecting you to read it. So instead I want you to read this. This is just zooming in then on the irregular regime change variable. And the star reflects that it's at least significant at the 0.05 confidence level. And so what you see here is leg, leader, irregular failure is across the models with main model, regional controls, year fixed effects, default, debt inflation. This one here is we remove from it any foreign imposed regime changes, because that is something that Gomans et al. Include in irregular, so it's not just coups. They say, well, if the United States, Iraq, for example. And so we said, well, maybe that's not really the story we're talking about, so let's remove those out. You can see it has a very marginal effect, marginal change on the coefficient here. So, and then we have a whole host of other tests, some of which I'm going to describe in a second here. Main thing though is that across these models, that's why I have approximately here, basically across these models, once you account for things, remember that it showed a little bit larger, smaller, but basically it increases the irregular leadership change, increases the risk of default, probability of default by about 100%. Okay, and again, by about meaning depends on which model you're using, with which control variables and so forth. But this does indicate that, and that's based on using these coefficients to then compute the predicted probability and so forth. But this seems to suggest that, yeah, irregular leadership change does seem to be this significant risk factor to increasing the probability of default. But again, we didn't need to have the fancy regressions to see that. We could have seen that from just the simple crosstabs. It's just another way of showing that we're trying to really nail down, is that what is going on? Does this capture that? Now, given that, we still conduct a whole host of various additional tests. And I don't think I'm supposed to be standing there. I'm supposed to stand here. We also use the Toms and Wright default data, and that was the data based in part on what my Toms captured. Now, I do know, in contrast to the Reinhardt-Rogoff, that this one does include partial restructuring. I just can't remember off the top of my head the Reinhardt-Rogoff, what they count. I do know that Toms and Wright. Nevertheless, he has this data. I'm not sure why, but he has this data for fewer countries than Reinhardt-Rogoff do. But we run the analysis with that additional variable, get very similar results. We also say, well, there's a difference between internal default and external default. Really, our story is about external default. So maybe we should make sure, and it turns out these results are driven by external default, not internal default. We also said, if our theory is right, is it really about a change in default policy? Meaning that if there's an irregular leadership change and you're in default, do you then start honoring your debts when you come back? And indeed, we find that that seems to be the case. That if there's a coup and the previous regime was in a default state, the new regime may now come in and say, you know what? We're going to start paying back this stuff. We're going we're going to now establish a different reputation. The old regime didn't honor its debts. We're going to honor our debts now. We look at various just technical controls of lag-dependent variables, random effects, fixed effects, era effects. So that's kind of getting a little bit at your question about the capital mobility, but it's not a direct measure of capital mobility. The question is,
Yeah, so with the last statement you made, has that ever happened that a new regime has come in or for whatever reason and said, we're going to start accommodating debt which was taken up by a previous regime? I mean, that'd be pretty awesome if that's it.
I want to say,
I think Eastern Europe.
yeah.
When
Correct. Okay,
there was government change at the end of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and I know like technically, depending on how you want to define Germany, in terms of like when they came back, that's the reason why it was only a couple years ago that Germany finally paid off the Treaty of Versailles reparations, right? It was because they technically went in and then once they were unified, the government wanted to show, look, we're going to play well, and even though that was years ago, we're now going to pay off those debts. So Germany was an example of that. I don't know if that was the case with the Russian Federation when Yeltsin came in, that and then the communist regime's gone. Did they now say we're going to honor the debts that the Bolsheviks defaulted on? Was that the case?
I don't know if it was linked to Bolshevik, but I think actually it was. I think they did honor some of the loans to France.
Yeah, that's
I remember the French case, and
Yeah.
I don't remember them repudiating anything.
No. What I'm saying
French, but whether they re-honored.
Yeah, what are they
I
honored?
do recall
I think they
the
re-honored
French
it.
case. I don't
Yeah,
remember more.
that's what I'm referring to is when Yeltsin, after the change, if he said now, similar to Germany, we're going to show that we're different from the from the communists. We're now going to honor those debts even that they defaulted on years ago, and so those would be examples of where regimes do this. This one here I want to talk about just for a few moments, which is so. Some of you have even highlighted some other control variables that we could account for and so forth. And the reality is that at the end of the day, there's, every model is incomplete in some way, right? It's a model, and so we can't account for everything. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to know, as a way to try to account for endogeneity, but also for a way to account for, is there some major omitted thing that we're not taking into consideration here? So we conducted matching analysis, which, real quick, for those of you who know what matching is it's in some ways very similar to regression analysis, but basically what you're doing is we use propensity score matching. What that means is you're saying, I in essence want to make my data almost like experimental data. I want to compare like cases, okay? So I take all my covariates and then I try to match them together, where the only difference between them is did they receive the treatment of irregular regime change or not. Okay? So that way you're kind of accounting for very similar like cases. This is one way you could make a principled approach to trying to deal for selection effects or endogeneity or so forth, is by saying, look, I'm comparing like cases, they're similar on all characteristics except for this one thing. That is on observables though. What if there's some unobservable thing that really makes the cases different? So one of the nice things that we do is first the matching analysis, and I can show those results during the Q&A, gives the same inference that we have from the regression analysis. But what the matching analysis is nice is you can then do sensitivity analysis, which is what you can do, and this was developed by Rosenbaum, is you can say, if I'm forgetting something, how big of an effect would it have to be on the probability of receiving the treatment versus the control for it to change my inference? Okay? So in other words, you come up with this parameter, it's called a gamma parameter. But basically what the gamma tells you is if your gamma is 2, it says that this omitted thing would have to change the probability of being in the treated group versus control group by 200% in order to change your inference. Okay? Well, we actually find, I believe, a gamma of somewhere in the neighborhood of 4. Okay? I think is what we find, and I have to look at the appendix again. I know it's over 2. And so, in other words, it's not to say that we have accounted for everything. It's not to say that there isn't some omitted thing, but it would have to have such a massive effect to change our inference. And we think that, given like the eye chart just saw, that we've accounted for so many things, we're probably not missing something that would have that massive an effect. Okay? And so that's one of the advantages of using kind of the sensitivity analysis approach. And then the other thing we do is we actually look at regular regime change, right? And what we find with regular regime change is a null effect, which is consistent with those charts I showed you, the tables, that, yeah, a lot of defaults are associated with regular change, but there's a lot of regular changes, so that's not a higher risk factor. Expecting a regular change, a change in leadership that's consistent with the rules, doesn't raise your risk because there's so many of those. Okay. So with that, conclusion, why do sovereigns default on debt? Well, what we want to be able to illustrate is that this is a political decision, and the way we do this is we say it can be explained largely, that's probably not the right word there, it's a nice word to have in a conclusion, but it's not. But we think that irregular leadership change is a useful way to be able to capture that indeed this is due to political factors, not due to economic factors. Yes, the economic factors constrain, totally dictate what decisions you're going to have to make, but there's still a decision that could be made. Given your economic fundamentals, it might say you need to cut social welfare spending, you need to raise interest rates, you need to do this. And those things could be done, but the government might say, but that's political suicide. I'm not going to want to do that. Okay. And then again, why we think this matters is it can help, this is an important part of the credible commitment stories, but we think that what we're really doing here is we're kind of taking it where Tom's left off. Tom said, hey, heterogeneity in preferences is what determines when leaders default or not. But I'm not going to explore that, and we think that this is a way of trying to capture that. Again, caveats aside, this is not the only way this is done. We think this is a very clear and principled way to be able to say, here's when you can see a change in preferences, and indeed that does seem to raise the risk of being in default. So with that, thank you very much, and you guys have already given a lot of great suggestions, but I would love to hear any more questions.
So I usually keep a list, but you've been fending for yourself just fine, so I'll let you keep your questions.
That sounds good. Yes, please.
I have some question about the causality, but first, I have a question about this regression model you used, because you're talking about this risk after having an irregular regime or leadership change. This risk might be a function of time as well. So I'm thinking about which survival model is better than logic.
That goes back to the one comment. I think that this is absolutely something it makes complete sense to do, which is to kind of look at how much does it raise the risk in that kind of a survival framework to kind of account for time, to even account for a decay in that probability that the first year after a default, it's very high because that's when the leader wants to say, I'm different, right? But then after that, it doesn't necessarily increase it. And so I think that's absolutely right. That's something I think we need to look into. Yes?
Question, Paul, about the causal mechanism in your theory. I'm going to sound a little bit like your Shiner last week.
Okay, no, please.
Probably just to provoke Christoph. But you know, if I tried to type it as you were saying, so essentially the mechanism is that the new rulers have little incentive to uphold the reputation of the past regime.
Yeah.
They're establishing their new reputation, so on and so forth. Now that's very much looking at it from the eyes of the rest of the international community, the creditors, but also the rest of the international society, like other states, etc. And I'm wondering, is it just my own rationality that's weird, or don't you also have a very clear incentive to actually create a reputation of reliability, especially knowing that for the sake of your political survival, right? You're in a deep political instability. You want to survive. You may very well need credit very soon, and so looking reliable is actually your utmost incentive, like rational incentive. And if you think about this in terms of political survival, not from the sort of outward perspective, but inward perspective, surviving political turmoil, you know, in the face of your own constituents, it also suggests to me that you should actually do the opposite, right? Which is, again, honor your commitment so that you're better able to, you know, it's not just a question of differentiating yourself from the former regime. It's also saying, hey, we've just overthrown the former rulers who were under heavy credit stress, right? And clearly that was a big problem for them. We don't want to get rid of that problem because we want to survive, so we're going to do the opposite of what they did, right? So it seems to me that you can actually turn the logic of the causal mechanism here on its head, and in my view, you get potentially a more convincing story.
Can I jump on this?
Yeah.
I keep thinking of the American Revolution, right? Which is maybe the example where you have people thinking about exactly this question, right? Completely new regime, And there's this discussion among the founding fathers about whether we should repudiate the debt or not. And they sigh, and you see the reasoning, and the reasoning is, if we do, our credit is shot for the next 5 decades. And so they decide to take on the debts of all 50 or however many states it was, which is something like $75 million at a time, which is very sizable. And so there you have the same situation, and you can't imagine a setting where you would want to distance yourself more, and yet the exact opposite decision along the lines of what Vincent's saying, which I agree sounds awfully intuitive, maybe more so than the story here, which is that I don't want to look like that other guy, so I'm going to shoot myself in the foot to distance myself.
So I, going into this, expected the same thing, right? Which is that this shouldn't have an effect. This shouldn't have a relationship because on the one hand I thought, it's like, no, irregular leadership change for this reason. It's like, well, yeah, there's probably better ways to establish a reputation. That being said, the more I started to think about it, the more I explored it, the more I could see where irregular leadership change makes sense, is that these leaders are doing it in contravention of established rules, right? So these are already leaders who are kind of like, whatever is the current norms about things here or the established conditions that the societies are, I'm coming in changing all of that, right? And so it already suggests to me that these are not necessarily leaders who feel a certain sense of obligation for written rules, right? Let alone any written commitments. So in that sense, I think that that's one reason why these leaders may not necessarily care that, well, yeah, we've obligated to this. But you're right, it is a bit puzzling that it's like, why would they want to run the risk of shooting the credit for 50 years, right? But I think part of the reality is that doesn't happen, right? Argentina's defaulted how many times? 9, 10 times, something like this. Because usually what happens is they default, and a few years later the investors come right back, right? And so I'm not so sure that it's a situation where they do say, oh, if we do this, we're not going to get credit anymore for 20 years. They might say, oh, we're not going to get credit maybe for the next year or so, but it's worth it to establish that we're different from the other regime, right? And so I think that that's what's going on. Because the reality is it's not the case that countries are prohibited from being able to borrow for years and years and years. In fact, in reality, they're able to borrow again quite quickly. But I see a bunch of hands going up on this point. So let me go here. Yeah.
Very, very, two quick question. The first one alongside this question is it possible then that there's two stories here and that the question of reputation may not be as it matters, but also it might be a question of relevance of the country vis-a-vis the potential investors? Meaning Pakistan, for example, could probably, in the Cold War, could have probably defaulted 10 times, and the US will still have funneled money within it. Whereas other country, Argentina seems weird to me, but other countries may be defaulting one and shooting their credits in the foot forever and ever, because geostrategically or for a variety of reasons, don't hold any water. So I'm just curious on your input on this. And the other one, I think was the gentleman's question, but I was checking the camera, so my apologies if I'm repeating. Is it possible that your causality could actually be reversed? As in, coups could have been caused by problems of defaults that are actually coding something else at default and more economic hardship and problems leading to an irregular.
So
did you guys play with this?
So that was kind of going back to the one question, people asked about this, that is it possible? And I think that looking at the attempted coups could be one way of trying to lay to rest that. I also mentioned we tried to do some principled matching type analysis to how hopefully deal with some sort of selection issue or endogeneity issues, but whether that's fully doing it or not, I like this idea of looking at the attempted coups. But kind of going back to your strategic point, part of it is countries, if they're not that important, either strategically or economically, they're probably not getting a lot of external debt to begin with, right? So part of the reason why Argentina is able to default is because they are very important to they're important to the international economy, or at least to the respect that they're a good location for investors in New York to send their money and so forth. So in that sense, the mere fact that you're getting a substantial amount of debt to actually get yourself into trouble shows that you're important enough that you could probably default on it. And this is part of the overall conundrum about sovereign debt, right? Which is that people think you're worth lending to for a reason. And so whether it's because of strategic reasons, because you're a key ally, or it's because you're a vital part of the global economy, you're able to get this money, and in many ways that stacks the deck in the favor of the government to say, well, I don't have to pay back this debt because it's now been established that I'm important enough that they'll eventually come back and give it to me again. There are some cases, though, where that's not the case. You know, the heavily indebted poor countries being a good example of this, right? Where they do acquire a lot of debt, they go into default on this, and the financing doesn't really come back. So this isn't all the time the case. But a lot of times countries who they're acquiring this finance for a reason. And it's usually due to one of those two areas of importance.
So then the story is not necessarily about the coup in itself, but perception of importance. As in, if I just made a coup and I realize that I'm still important in the eyes of international actors, well, I may default. But the same default could have been made by the same reason without the change of leadership or a regular change of leadership. So therefore, the coup may not be the actual cause in the whole story, if your answer there is correct.
So what I would say to that is that, yes, the fact that you're receiving, it goes back to my statement about you can't remove the sovereign from sovereign debt, right? The very fact that you're receiving external loans and financing and being able to borrow abroad already immediately creates the conditions where you could default on it. It's a matter of, do you have a desire as a leader to, what kind of reputation do you want to have? And so that, in that sense, that's why I think the coup does matter, is that, yes, that previous leader, by the very fact that they're getting external debt, could decide to default, but they have a certain interest in having a particular reputation, and so they don't do it. But the new leader doesn't have that interest in having the reputation, and so therefore they decide to default. And so I still think that that heterogeneity in preferences of the leader is still important to explain the default. But you're right, the mere fact that you're getting the finance always creates the potential that you could default on it. Now, there are other questions. Yes,
yeah, I had a slightly different set of questions on the other side. And that's, Matt raised a question about international capital mobility and some of the comments about reputation. I'll make it sound like there's one reputation and one market on the other side. And so I'm just wondering whether you wouldn't find some difference if there are a number of financial centers competing against each other as opposed to one. So it's a different thing to default in 1890 when you could really only borrow in London a significant amount of money than it is today.
Right.
So that would be one thing. And the other thing was, I wouldn't think international capital mobility was the issue. I would think the composition of the debt makes a difference, and maybe the term, to default on 3-year loans or 5-year loans today may not be nearly the same. You're not paying the same cost as you would if you're defaulting on 20-year loans. So maybe you could link that to what you think you're capturing with the era effects that you have.
Well, that was immediately what came to mind, is that I think you're exactly right. Like, especially, unfortunately, as I mentioned before, I'd love it if we could go further back into the 19th century, because then you have like the prime time of like the Rothschild influence and so forth. And so you could really say, look, when there's really just a few potential lenders, it's a very different dynamic. But we're not able to go that far back into the 19th century with our data, which is unfortunate. Because I do think that you're right, that, and many people have talked about this fact that, in today's system where there's many more sources and the global financial institutions that can lend money, it's a different dynamic than earlier. I do think our era variables are capturing that a little bit. One thing that we could potentially do is actually do our analysis by eras, not just include this, but actually see, look, is there a difference if you just run the analysis after 1970 versus in the interwar period versus in the pre-1945 or pre-1914 period? And I think that would be one way to actually capture this as well. Because you're right, there are these structural differences in terms of the number of lenders that are available. Yes?
I was going to make a similar point. I think you've got a big structural break at 1914 when you had relatively open capital markets. 1945 to 70, you had relatively closed capital markets, and then open capital markets afterward. But what you also have from 45 onward is the IMF and the potentiality of official assistance to fill financing gaps, so that if you actually are constructive rather than repudiate, you can have your balance of payments financed. So I think it changes the incentive substantially for even a post-coup regime to be constructive rather than repudiate. So you should see it, I would guess you would see it dampening.
I think
Incentives
you're
to
right.
repudiate after 1945, and also smaller debt burdens because you didn't have open capital markets until the end of Bretton Woods. So you've got much smaller amounts to default on. I do think, though, it's easy to overblow the extent to which you really have a competitive situation now in terms of sources of finance. If you're issuing bonds on international markets, it's under either English law or New York law. So there are really only two legal regimes.
It's true.
And if you look at Argentina, it hasn't issued since 2003 because it's subject to attachment in both of those legal regimes.
Yeah.
Now, it could get a private placement with China, but that's about it.
Yeah.
That's really the only other
That's-
alternative.
yeah, that's true.
There is a lot more information sharing after the 80s debt crisis, between the creditors that wasn't there.
Yeah,
before.
that's for sure.
It may be fair to talk about.
But
the
nevertheless-
market now.
Yeah.
before that.
But nevertheless, your point is a valid one, which is even if that is the case, that actually is not all that different. This is still something that we can empirically investigate. Actually, see, is it different? By breaking up into these eras. Real quick, just because I figured, I couldn't remember off the top of my head. I just wanted to turn to the paper real quick to see how exactly did Reinhardt and Rogoff define this, and I think we're going to have to dig even deeper because the extent to which I now remember is they define default as a state reneging on its public debt service requirements.
So I think that's a very broad definition.
Exactly.
And certainly your data set implies it.
Yes, that's right. And so, does that mean partial? Does it mean that? And I think it does, but the exact nature of it, I want to go back and do a little bit more digging, and just so that we can more precisely say. But I think it does, it does include the partial.
I just think, given Reinhardt and Rogoff's individual papers,
Yeah.
they aren't narrowly interested just in
Yeah.
full repudiation. They're interested in debt restructuring.
They fix it on a particular percentage. So they say if the debt restructuring and the value of debt has decreased by a certain amount, fixed at a percentage, then it counts as. So
Okay.
That's what. So it is renegotiation.
Yeah, it is renegotiation as well. But yeah, I wanted, since that was a key, I wanted to bring this up in the paper to be like, oh, maybe, because again, I can't remember off the top of my head. I wrote it down so I wouldn't have to remember it. So this is good.
So
Yes.
So I have a quick suggestion, I think, and that would account for some of these questions which were raised about the fact that, so there are some key factors in this model, right? As someone who's coming up with a coup attempt, you want to differentiate yourself. Let's leave that on one side. The other thing which you have going in the model is the coup itself is being treated exogenously.
Yes.
Now I think if you look at a larger model, if you make the coup attempt, the success of a coup attempt endogenous, you'll actually be able to accommodate things like this. Because think of it in the following way: the success of a coup attempt can be driven by one of two things. You either get domestic support or you get international support, which makes it work.
Yeah.
Right? In a scenario where you're facing a high level of international debt, so essentially your external debt far outweighs your internal debt, then you have to keep up your promises with the international audience, right? So if you want your coup to succeed, then you presumably need them to do things. On the other hand, if domestic support is enough to get you through with the coup, then you can forget about the external debt that you're carrying, and that would mean that you would actually be successful. So while you may choose to differentiate yourself either by, okay, I'm going to respect international debt, or I'm just going to reject it, the success, if you make it endogenous, then what you'll end up finding is that the coups which are successful in times of financial distress were the ones which said, forget external debt, because all I need is domestic support. On the other hand, if this is a proxy government, which is being run essentially by a foreign country, could be the US, could be Russia, in those scenarios, typically you'll have the new regime saying, no, I'm going to actually respect the international debt, and that puts you in bound.
Yeah.
Right? So just by making it endogenous, I just think you'll be able to accommodate
So,
this.
two responses. One of them is a bit, well, so first of all, would you suggest doing something even like in a simultaneous equation framework of kind of saying, look, there's really, these two processes could very well be simultaneous to each other, and so therefore you have a model where you're predicting default, but at the same time you have a model predicting coups because the two inform each other. Would that be one potential approach?
So I understand where this is coming from, but I really think that the causal mechanism is working in the other direction.
Mhm.
So I think what you have here, if just turned around, would be a really, really good model in some sense of predicting coups.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
That's-
So, Rohan, are you saying that the success of a coup, so the actors behind the coup, the military or something, they have access to debt? Because they don't, right?
No, they don't have access to that. They have access to the new set of promises which are going to be made, right? So in some sense, see, here's in some sense the prediction model you can drive on. You know what the debt level is of a country before a coup, is a coup attempt is made.
Yeah.
Right? This information is available to those, those attempting a coup as well. They know what the financial situation of the country is. They know what's important and where the public sympathies lie. So if you're a rich country, there's nothing to worry about. Nobody's going to care about a new regime which says we're going to get rid of external debt because we were dealing with it fine, right? On the other hand, if you're going through a lot of financial stress, the domestic audience is going to love you, right? Because we don't have to pay any debt. We can just start financing everything.
So I'm going to say two things to that. First of all, I do want to try to account for this in not two things, I want to say three things. First of all, I want to try to account for this simultaneous framework. Second thing is, in terms of the external actor, that's where you get into how, like I said, in the one model we tried to remove foreign imposed regime change. Now, foreign imposed could be done in a lot of different ways. It could be done in the Iraq way, which is literally the military comes in, runs out. It could also be done in the more subtle way that you're trying to classify. I believe that Goman's, when they define it, they classify it as either way. That it's like if it's clear that it was external support that was leading to it. But I mean, again, because that's all cloak and dagger, it can be hard to actually quantify with it. But we try to at least account for it in that way. That being said, I don't think we just have a model that predicts coups, right? Though that's a useful thing, and boy, we could measure it. I still think that's a useful contribution. I do think that it's that the coups themselves actually lead to the default policy. I think that the economic conditions can inform whether or not there'll be a coup. I think it's important to account for that. And so that's why I think that maybe bringing in more of the simultaneous frameworks there. But I don't think that it's just the external determines the coups. I do think that the change in leadership is critical to then seeing that there's default. Because not all changes in leadership, not all regular changes lead to default, but it is a big risk factor, and not all defaults are determined by even regular leadership changes. So some of them are no change at all. So I don't think it's just something that's predicting coups in that respect. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, something tells me that the circumstances or the conditions, the political conditions surrounding or precipitating the coup would matter in terms of what the new leadership does in whether or not it's going to honor its debt or not. It would seem to me that if there's a popular movement that supports the coup and the leaders have to be accountable to that movement, they would be more likely to default on debt, for nationalist reasons or, perceptions of the previous regime being illegitimate. Whereas there may be some cases where coups are maybe not as irregular, or in some countries you may have coups that are sort of intra-elite, happen fairly frequently. Thailand kind of comes to mind, where there may be or may not be, a popular mobilization behind it, and there may be some cases where the leadership has to establish its reputation more than in other cases. And I'm just wondering if there's any way of, if you've accounted for that or thought about that at all.
So what you're saying is that in a way it's a common theme with some of the other through the other comments that are there times where it's really important due to other conditions that this new leadership establishes a different reputation? Right. Which could apply to not just irregular, but also regular regime changes. And if we could capture that, we could potentially explain even more defaults. My answer is yes. Yeah, I think that's right. And so in that respect, I think that what we're doing is in many ways a more conservative test. In that we're saying, look, what we're looking at is regular changes Does it lead to default? But we're not necessarily, other than controlling for different contextual variables such as debt levels, political instability, and so forth. We're controlling for those, but we're not conditioning in the fact that we're doing like a modifying variable or something to that effect. But I think that in this respect, we're doing a more conservative test, because I think that, and by conservative meaning that it should work against us finding something, because I think that if we do account for those things, we would be able to explain even more of the defaults. Because I think the things that you're highlighting shouldn't just apply to irregular changes. They should apply to regular changes. Hence the Argentina example, right? That it's like that was a regular change, but because the conditions, political and economic, were such that there was a desire to change the reputation, that new leader came in and changed the reputation. So, but in that respect, so I agree with what you're saying, and in a bigger project, that's what we do. This one is, like I said, we feel like we're being a little more conservative in our testing by only looking at, did the irregular change lead to default? There was a
yeah, I'm just trying to think of how best to put this, but could it be a case where the new regime has come in? It's like we've just overthrown the previous regime. We've completely overturned the political and social order. You know, defaulting on the debt is not going to make anything worse.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a sense that there's generally that the debt imposes a certain set of constraints on the government budget, you have to repay it, and it's a way that they can instantly make things better, quote unquote, and deliver and cement sort of their authority by giving out, by distributing to certain parts of the selectorate, as it were.
So this kind of goes back to Vincent's question about, shouldn't they just like honor this because it's going to, and the reality is that, and this is something that I think we play up a little bit more in the paper, I haven't played up as much during this presentation, is time and consistency problems is a huge issue, right? And indeed that's one of the primary things that's talked about when it comes to default. And so a lot of times, due to that time and consistency problem, they can sit there and go, sure, yeah, this might, even though setting aside it actually doesn't, but this might hurt our ability to borrow for the next 5 years or 6 years, so forth. But right now, I want to be able to spend more money on giving people a gasoline subsidy, or to be able to give people groceries, or to do that. So I'm defaulted on this debt, so I can give these people the stuff now, because it's ultimately about solidifying support of the winning coalition. And yeah, that might hurt my ability going down the road, but I need to do this now. And since I want to show that I can do what the previous regime couldn't do, which is I can provide for this stuff, even though yes, I'm wrecking things for the future, right? And so I think, hitting this time and consistency problem is, and in many ways that's a lot of literature's point to this. That's also why you will see defaults sometimes with regular changes too. You're going to follow up.
It's almost like you have the domestic audience cost and the international audience cost, and the costs apply differently to each realm.
Exactly. And in many ways, because of this time and consistency, it's about, look, I'm fine, okay, I'm not going to be able to borrow for 4 years, but the reality is I've got enough money, I have enough money in the coffers now, we can give these groceries, fuel taxes, or fuel subsidies, and so forth. Yes, and then we'll come to Crystal. Yeah.
To what extent the fact that there is a coup is a cost? And for example, if you take the example of Egypt, of the revolution in 2011, there was a coup or a regime change, and it creates a lot of problems of social and economic problem, and then the situation deteriorates. And in the case of a regular change, there is not that cost, obviously, because there is no social trouble. So
right.
Maybe after an irregular coup, you have economic problems that create you an incentive not to pay your debt.
Yeah, I think that, so what you're referring to is, as in the case of Egypt, where you have this major regime change and then you have these problems. I mean, part of that though depends, some people would say that no, the problems that Egypt's experiencing now they were exacerbated by the change, but these were things that had been festering for a long time, and the change just kind of finally made them evident, the economic problems, or there's
if you look at 40% of the economy was linked to the tourism. Tourism disappeared like that.
And that would be a clear one where the political instability leads to these huge economic problems for it. I think really your question in many ways is just touching back to some of the other questions like here about these contextual variables, that if you can count for the context, that if that if you can account for that context, you might be able to better explain when an actual leadership change, any type of leadership change, could lead to instability. And again, we haven't done that here. What we've just done here is said any irregular change, does that raise the probability of default? Because it might turn out, I said here that on average, across our models, it increases the probability of default by 100%. Well, it may turn out that if we properly account for these contextual variables, in some instances, it increases the probability by 1,000%, right? Because it's like, this is prime conditions. And we haven't done that, so it's biasing against us finding a result here. But I think your question kind of goes back to your questions and the other questions about if you can account for that context, you may actually find a bigger effect, not just for coups, but even for other type of regular changes.
But maybe it's not just the context, maybe all irregular coup creates that. So maybe you would have, that would be an exception. The coup does not create economic problem, and then that allows new rulers to pay.
And that goes back to kind of the question about the endogeneity too, that it's like if the coup leads to this type of instability economically, and then that funnels into it, and that's where, again, I think not just the endogeneity, but that's where getting at the time variance could come in, because if the coup, thinking about Egypt, if Egypt eventually defaults because of economic turmoil, it's taking time for that to take hold. And so, that's where it could be important to kind of account for, well, if there's a change, does it decay over time? Does it increase over time? Is it steady over time? That's something we haven't yet accounted for. Christoph.
So you answered Colin's point with this time inconsistency story that I'm quite sympathetic to. But the story you tell is all about reputation. It's a very odd, in my view, image of reputation where it's, it's your image of yourself. That's not what reputation is. Your reputation is others' image of you, right? And you don't spend much time talking about others. So, and we've been talking about, whether capital is whether the debt is available or not. The real question, that is always available, but at what cost? Yeah. And that's the strength of the Tom's book, right? He's able to calculate that. And so I'm wondering, because your reputation story is a set of actors that are perfectly rational and they're rationally deciding, I'm distancing myself from the past regime. So do you have these testable implications about markets' reaction to that? Meaning that, this is a complete different regime, so we're not going to, they start from scratch, and we're not going to penalize them if they default because that's not their reputation yet, right? Which I'd be very suspicious of. I think that regime, that new post-coup leader would immediately get penalized and face high risk premium. But your story seems to suggest that they shouldn't, that the markets would really see this as, and there's some of this literature about reputations and does reputation travel across leaders and so on, and especially credibility.
Yeah.
So do you agree that that's an implication of the story you have here, that the market should say, okay, well, blank slate, you default, but we're not yet, time starts tomorrow.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely an implication, and it's one we haven't tested yet in this paper. We both have other papers where we've looked at borrowing costs. My paper I have forthcoming in IO, I'm looking at central banks and how it impacts borrowing costs. Patrick has one in JCR where he's looking at borrowing costs. You're exactly right in that this paper has implications for borrowing costs, which is that, because the borrowing costs reflect that behavior of the external actors, right? What they're thinking. And they're saying that, okay, what we should be able to do is see, does that coup, does it lead to a dramatic increase in borrowing costs? Does it lead to a sharp increase and then it comes back down? Which is like, okay, no, they're fine. Okay, we're going to let them here. I think that it does have implications for looking at borrowing costs, and I think that that's something else that we should look into. Now the question is that something that we can look into in this paper, right? Or is that another implication for another paper? That's kind of the key. But you're exactly right, there are implications for that. I think that's addressing what you're asking about. Yes?
I think one interesting thing, if you're going to look at time, would be to look at, and I'm reminded of Crane Brinton's Anatomy of Revolution, like a book written in like the 50s, I think, which I read as an undergrad. And I was fascinated by this idea that revolutions go through different stages, so they're not just a discrete event. And I'm not sure that if you talk coup d'etat, you include revolutions in coup d'etat. Okay, so, and in that case, like, it's a process, right? So as we're saying that war is a process, well, revolutions are also a process that occur over time. And so at first, oftentimes you have a coalition that takes power, and then there's a battle within the coalition. And so the incentives could be different at different stages of that process. So if looking over time, you could see that initially, well, your incentives are to establish your reputation domestically among your coalition, so that you're going to be that group that finally takes hold of the key positions within government. And then over time, well, then you turn to the international community and you start thinking more long term. So, I mean, looking over at time would be interesting to look at the beast itself. So, coup d'etat or revolution, what is it? How does it work, play out?
You're right, and so these irregular changes, some of them do occur in revolution, but all that variable codes is there a regular leadership change, regardless of context.
Yeah.
Sometimes it might be just a pure, these insiders decided to change over, there was no wider revolution. Sometimes there could be a revolution. One of the things we try to account for is political instability within the country and so forth, which sometimes leads to leadership change, sometimes doesn't. Sometimes the leader's able to hold on for a long time, sometimes they're not. So our variable is just, when is there that change, and was it done in contravention of the rules? But again, it kind of goes back to these things about kind of capturing the context, which to me seems like to be a really fruitful thing. Indeed, is probably why, remember I mentioned we did a test where we looked at regular leadership change to found a null result, right? That's probably, and to me, that's going back to what I was saying to you guys, which is we're doing a conservative test on this stuff, right? We're just saying, did it lead to default? And we're finding, well, regular ones, no, but it's because we're not accounting, we're not modifying it by these conditions. And I think if we do, then you would start to see, oh, well, regular change under these conditions of revolution, regular change under conditions of high debt levels, regular change under conditions of decline in the economy. Now that increases the probability of it. And so, again, right now we're just doing this more conservative test. But I think if we do start to account for these modifying effects, then we could actually find even larger.
Right, I'd say this is like a long-term project. Of course, if you're looking into mechanisms and interested in identifying
exactly
these, so the when, how of this stuff.
Absolutely. Next question. Yes, you. Oh.
You can get Matt here.
Oh, Matt, did you?
Yeah. So I'm keep coming back to this idea of like why the default, right? So I mean your story here is that the default is a means to an end of differentiation from the previous regime. And it strikes me that, I mean, well, and the other alternative that we've heard a lot now is that it's a response to demand for alleviation, that might be domestically. Should it matter then whether or not the debt is politicized prior to the coup? I mean, and is that somewhat of a testable implication for what the causal mechanism that's actually underlying this process?
Yeah, I think this again gets at this context part. Now, that would be neat. I don't think that data exists, but that would be neat data to code, is like the extent to which there's protests over the debt, like Argentina.
Is there a discourse around the debt before the coup? And I mean, I granted, like that would be such a difficult thing to add into your existing model, and would I mean probably be something that you'd need to look at qualitatively. But I mean that would be, I think, strong evidence one way or another that about the actual causal mechanism.
Absolutely. Now I do think that there are ways to indirectly get at it, which is that you would expect there to be more of a discourse about it, given the other variables we've talked about. There's economic turmoil, high debt levels, rising costs. Those things would probably, those are typically the things that then lead people to talk about the debt and so forth. But that's really pointing to, I think, could be a really nice project. I know my chair of my department, Jan Kubrick, who does a lot of stuff on like social movements and so forth, and protests and things. He's been creating a whole data set on like when there's been protests and so forth. So I actually have to talk to him about the extent to which they look at, are these protests motivated by economic factors, right? Because I do know he's been coding that. I don't think they've coded to the extent of saying it's protests over the debt, but I do think that he's been able to code it to it's protests about the economy and so forth. And that could be another way to be able to capture this. Yes?
Does the Reinhard Rogoff data tell you the difference or the balance between the international and the domestic debt?
Yes.
And does it also tell you about the balance and what's being defaulted on?
Yes, and as I mentioned, what I did in the robustness checks was we did, it does not, you probably could compute it, I don't think you can compute it, but they do code whether it's external debt or internal default, and they code whether it's both or one or the other. And so we ran the test where we only look at external, we run the test where we only look at internal debt. Internal debt, there's no effect. It's external. It's about the debt that you're borrowing from abroad. And that's where the action's going on. That's what's leading to default. Which to us, I mean, again, it doesn't point to, but to us, we think that that points more to it's about this story of establishing a reputation versus other things, because it doesn't lead to a higher default a higher probability I default on my own people. It leads to a higher probability I default on these external actors. And that, to me, we've interpreted that as that's something that should be an indication that this is more about a reputation story versus just a pure constraint story. Yeah.
But, okay, so I have to think about that for a second. So after the coup, it's more likely that they'll default on external.
Yes.
So why isn't the story, I want sovereignty, I want to back a coup if I'm a domestic creditor? I would rather my debt be privileged over international debt.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're saying, why isn't it a story of
the two audiences, the domestic audience
Right.
and the foreign one, and you're a sovereign actor, so I can't beat the state if it doesn't want to pay me unless I actually take over the state. And then I make sure they pay me, but
right,
not from the outside.
Right. And so in this case, it would be a story of it's more about
Who gets paid, but not everyone's going to get paid, as
Ah,
opposed to a
okay.
reputational.
Okay, I see. And so I'm taking over to ensure that I get paid. So one way to do that would be looking at, was there a chance of an internal default prior to the coup or something like that? And basically that's the story that you're laying out would be, okay, there was a chance the existing regime was going to default on the internal debt. There's a coup, and now there's not a default on the internal debt because I did the coup in order to get paid. Sure, get paid. Definitely a plausible story. I can't think of a case immediately comes to mind like that, right?
I'm sure we can find one.
I'm sure we can find one. Yes, I'm sure we can find one. Existence proof, right? We were talking about that earlier. Yes.
Last question.
Okay.
Sorry, I have time.
Yeah, just
Okay.
one thing on the domestic debt. I think domestic debts are fundamentally different from the international debts because there are just more things you can do to default it without defaulting, like you control the money supply, the interest
Yeah, you
rates.
can inflate it
So there
away.
are a lot more things you can do if you're the government, right? So
Yeah.
you don't have to default it
Yeah.
to postpone it, and there's just a lot more things.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can inflate away the value of the debt
Exactly,
and so
yeah,
forth.
and that's
Yeah.
less obvious, and nobody can say it's a default.
Yeah, and then that's why foreign investors don't want the debt to be denominated, the external debt to be denominated in your currency because you
Exactly.
can inflate it away. They want it to be, going back to the Ike and Green's original sin idea that, no, we need that debt, even though you're Argentina, to be denominated in dollars. So I think that's right, that there's more instruments in the hands of the leader to be able to handle domestic debt. They don't need to do an outright default. Suggesting that maybe they do actually change these, but they're not doing it in a way that we're capturing here.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.